In the dead of night, on a deserted highway, a black man was forced to lean his face against the cold hood of his car. No explanation, no clear evidence. Only a pair of icy handcuffs and the gaze of a police officer slowly losing control. A few hours later, that same man appeared in court, dressed sharply in a tailored suit. No cuffs, no bowed head. And when his name was spoken in the courtroom, the entire room fell silent. No one, not even the officer who arrested him the night before, could have imagined who they were dealing with. And what happened next changed the entire system. Who do you think he is, and why did the entire city have to get involved? Stay with this story, the truth is only just beginning. Near midnight, Highway 185 circling the outskirts of Columbus, Georgia, was nearly empty. The air was damp from an earlier rain, and the asphalt reflected blurry patches of yellow light from the flickering street lamps above. High-pressure lamps blinked in and out, and the distant hum of insects blended into an eerie silence, creating a still, chilling atmosphere. In the right lane, a silver sedan glided smoothly, almost soundlessly. Inside the vehicle was a man named Malik Hayes, 37 years old, driving home after a long day. He had just left St. Mary Medical Center, where his mother was being treated after a mild heart attack. His face looked tired, his eyes carried a hint of concern, but his gaze remained steady, like someone long accustomed to late-night drives and quiet thoughts. Malik wore nothing that stood out. Just a black turtleneck, a dark sweatshirt over it, jeans, and sneakers. No badge, no name tag, nothing to indicate who he was. He looked like any ordinary man trying to end his day in peace. Soft jazz played from the car speakers, the sound of a saxophone floating through the confined space, syncing with his fingers as they tapped gently on the steering wheel. A subconscious, rhythmic gesture, almost like a ritual to stay awake and relaxed. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth noticing. Until suddenly, red and blue lights flashed behind his car. Malik glanced into the rearview mirror. The lights blinked rapidly, urgent. A police cruiser sped up and latched onto his tail. Instinct kicked in immediately. Malik sighed, turned the wheel gently, flipped on the signal, and pulled smoothly onto the shoulder. He switched on the interior lights, placed both hands on the steering wheel, palms open, visible. No rush. No hesitation. He knew how to do things right. He had done nothing wrong. But Malik knew all too well, sometimes doing things right, still wasn't enough. From the patrol car, a man stepped out. Tall and broad-shouldered, his heavy boots thudded against the damp pavement. Sergeant Rick Dalton, a local police officer, approached with the usual air of superiority. His left hand rested loosely on his belt where a low-slung gun sat. His right hand held a flashlight, unlit. His face showed no expression, only a kind of detached boredom, as if this were just another routine stop in the middle of the night. Dalton didn't greet him. No introduction. No reason given for the stop. He simply spoke through the lowered window, cold and curt, license and registration. His tone was dismissive, clipped, laced with clear disrespect. Malik slowly turned his head. His eyes were still calm, though a flicker of surprise crossed his face. Not because he was asked for papers, but because of the way this officer was behaving. He nodded slightly, then moved his right hand carefully toward the glove compartment, cautious with every motion. The air grew heavy. This was no longer a routine traffic stop. It was control. The opening move of something far bigger, something Malik couldn't yet see coming. Dalton took the documents from Malik's hand without even glancing at his face. His fingers flipped through the vehicle registration lazily, pretending to read, while his eyes silently scanned the outside of the car. The street light cast uneven shadows across his face, revealing fine lines at the corners of his mouth and a cold gaze laced with undisguised prejudice. Just a few seconds later, Without checking a single detail further, Dalton cleared his throat and said something that instantly shifted the atmosphere, "Your tail light is out." Malik tilted his head slightly. He was no stranger to this kind of traffic stop. But his voice remained polite, measured. "I had my car checked last week. The shop said everything was fine." He spoke slowly, not in defiance, but as a factual response to what he knew. And in that very moment, he saw Dalton's eyes narrow. Not because of the light, but because that calm reply had touched a fragile nerve. Dalton lifted his head, his voice tightening, barely masking the irritation rising in his chest. "Are you arguing with a police officer?" The question was a trap, thrown out like bait, waiting for one wrong move. Malik exhaled softly. His eyes looked straight ahead, then shifted to Dalton's, steady and unprovocative. "I'm not arguing. I'm telling the truth." His tone was even, not a hint of tremble. But that composure, to someone like Dalton, only made him angrier. Dalton inhaled sharply through his teeth, then suddenly barked an order, "Step out of the vehicle." No explanation. No reason given beyond the command itself. No paperwork. No justification. Just because he wanted to. Malik turned his head and looked at the officer again. "May I ask why, officer?" In any ordinary situation, that question might have led to a conversation. But here, it only fueled Dalton's annoyance. "Because I said so." The response landed like a slap across the face of any notion of fairness. Malik understood he was being tested, not for a traffic violation, but simply because of his presence. He slowly unbuckled his seat belt, opened the door, and stepped out. Each movement weighed down not by fear, but by a growing, quiet frustration. On the highway, no other cars passed by. No one stopped. No cameras. No witnesses. Nothing. Dalton stood upright and pointed ahead with a sharp gesture, "Hands on the hood." "Now." Malik said nothing. He walked to the front of the car, placed both hands on the cold metal surface. His eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, silently wondering why, even when he did everything right, he still had to live in constant defense. Dalton stepped in behind him. The officer's breath brushed the back of Malik's neck. In the thick silence of the night, the sense of power being abused pressed tighter and tighter around him, inch by inch. Malik remained in place, both hands resting on the hood, his back slightly bent forward. The night was still as quiet as when it began, but the air between the two men had grown increasingly thick. In that silence, Malik spoke, his voice not loud but clear in the night. "Why am I being detained?" He wasn't reacting out of defiance. He simply wanted to know why a man with no obvious violation was being forced to stand on the side of a highway with his hands on the car like a criminal. Dalton heard the question as if it were a personal insult. He turned his head, eyes narrowing, a deep line creasing his brow. His voice suddenly rose, no longer restrained, obstructing a law enforcement officer. 6 heavy words delivered like a sentence. No evidence, no explanation, no right or wrong. He didn't even look at Malik when he said it, as if the verdict was self-evident from the moment he saw him. Before Malik could ask another word, Dalton stepped in, turned him around with a sharp motion. No warning. No notice. He pulled the handcuffs from his belt and locked Malik's wrists on the spot. The sound of metal clinking together rang cold and loud in the dark. Malik flinched. His wrists were pulled back hard, muscles tightening in reflex. The cuffs were freezing, clamping down too tightly around his skin. So tight he had to grit his teeth to endure it. He winced but forced himself to remain calm. No struggle. No shouting. Nothing that could be twisted into justification. He knew even the smallest gesture could be turned against him. Dalton leaned in close to his shoulder, his breath brushing Malik's neck like a warning. He let out a dry chuckle, his voice dripping with mockery. "Who do you think you are?" In that question was arrogance, the kind born from using authority to belittle others. No reason needed, just difference. Malik didn't answer. He stood upright, his eyes not looking down, nor turning away. Not out of pride, but because he refused to show fear. Refused to surrender to something so clearly unjust. Dalton grabbed his shoulder and shoved him toward the patrol car. A rough push, just strong enough to throw off balance. Malik stumbled slightly, his back hitting the edge of the open door. The officer didn't hesitate. One hand on Malik's head, the other on his shoulder, forcing him into the back seat. No explanation. No compassion. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off all outside light. Inside the car, Malik sat silently. His eyes stared through the thick window, where street lights flickered by in blurred streaks. The hard plastic seat pressed against his spine, his wrists throbbed with heat and pain. But above all, he felt something rise in his chest. A sensation growing stronger by the second. His intuition had never failed him. And this time, it whispered clearly in his mind, this wasn't over. Not even close. The patrol car came to a stop in front of the Muskogee County Police Station. The building wasn't large, its exterior clad in old gray bricks, a flickering yellow light hanging above the uneven porch. Inside, the hallway stretched long and silent, the air cold and unwelcoming. Dalton opened the car door and pulled Malik out. The cuffs were still on, biting tightly into his wrists, leaving 2 clear red marks. He didn't say a word, just gave Malik's shoulder a slight push, signaling him to walk straight through the entrance. Their footsteps echoed sharply on the tiled floor. Inside the intake room, a long desk stood with a few officers seated behind it. They glanced at Malik briefly, then looked back down at their paperwork. No one asked questions. No one seemed curious. They had seen scenes like this before. And they chose not to interfere. Malik stood tall, eyes scanning each face. Not out of curiosity, but to remember. The air here was thick, not from lack of oxygen, but from the apathy hanging like a cloud above him. Dalton led him to the booking area. His fingers danced over the keyboard, calling for assistance. A young officer appeared, didn't ask for a name, simply motioned for Malik to extend his hands. Cold. His fingers were pressed onto a glass panel for fingerprints without a word. Each finger. Then his face. Malik was taken to have his photo taken. The flash went off in an instant. The image quietly entered the system. No formal charge. Just an excuse. Dalton stood behind him, arms crossed. He looked at Malik as if everything was over, as if he had just taught him a lesson. He tilted his head slightly and muttered with biting sarcasm, "Thought you were somebody, huh? Now you can sit and think about that." Malik turned his head, his eyes steady. He didn't speak at length. Just one short, clear sentence, "You have no idea what you're doing." Dalton laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed in the quiet room. "I know exactly what I'm doing." He emphasized every word, as if to reassure himself that he was still in control. Then he turned around and walked away without another glance. A moment later, Malik was taken to a holding cell. No one said anything further. The iron door closed behind him, the lock clicked heavily. Inside was a small space, walls painted in faded gray, a flickering fluorescent light above that looked like it might go out any second. No bed. Just a bench bolted to the wall and a cold stainless steel table. Malik sat down. His hands still ached. His shoulders throbbed after the long journey and the rough handling. But he kept breathing steadily. No panic. No rage. His eyes drifted up to the low ceiling, then slowly closed for a brief moment. Outside, everything seemed still. But inside him, something was waiting to be set free. It wasn't fear. It was truth. And he knew, it would come. Sooner or later. Not long after the cell door shut, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, sharp, hurried, unmistakable. Malik remained still, his gaze fixed on the iron bars in front of him. He didn't need to look to know who was coming. Only one person in the station walked like that. The door swung open. Dalton appeared. He stood just outside the cell, arms crossed over his chest, eyes scanning Malik from head to toe like he was measuring someone beneath him. His face no longer carried the smirk it had before. Instead, there was something else, something closer to a simmering frustration. Men like you think a little attitude makes you something special, huh? His voice was hoarse and low, laced with an anger he didn't bother to hide. He wasn't looking for a response. He just needed to release the pressure building inside him. Malik didn't move. Didn't look up. Didn't speak. But then, slowly, he raised his head and looked Dalton straight in the eye. That gaze didn't challenge. It didn't fear. It was calm. So honest that Dalton hesitated, just for a second. But only a second. He stepped closer, leaning toward the bars. The space between them now just a few feet. His voice dropped further, dripping with bitterness. Guys like you always think you're different. Each word came out like venom, as if just saying them affirmed his own superiority. Malik didn't flinch. He didn't lower his head or avert his eyes. He said one sentence, quiet as breath but sharp as steel. I don't think. I know. Dalton froze. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not intimidation. Something else. Doubt. He couldn't understand how a black man, cuffed and sitting in a cold cell, could speak those words with that unshakable calm. He swallowed, as if trying to push down something rising in his throat. But before he could say anything else, a voice called from the hallway, stopping both men in their tracks. Sir, there's a call from the city. The newcomer was a young officer, barely past his early 20s, holding a traditional landline handset from the front desk. His voice carried a hesitant tone, like he wasn't sure if now was the right time to interrupt. Dalton blinked, visibly thrown. He glanced quickly at Malik, as if trying to regain control of the moment. But Malik's expression didn't waver. Still that same composure. No words. No retreat. Just watching. Dalton drew a deep breath and stepped back. He turned, walking briskly down the hall, his boots hitting the tile floor harder than they needed to, releasing something he didn't know how else to handle. Behind him, Malik tilted his head slightly, eyes following each step until Dalton's figure vanished behind the closing door. In that moment, a thought surfaced in his mind, spreading like ripples on water. Maybe, just maybe, the truth was beginning to speak. And for the first time that night, a faint smile appeared on his lips. Not out of triumph. But because he knew, he didn't need to do anything more. The rest would reveal itself. The air inside the station suddenly grew tense. From the hallway beyond, raised voices broke the silence. The argument was sharp, fast, occasionally interrupted by someone trying to lower their tone. Malik sat quietly in the cell, but his ears were wide awake. He tilted his head, listening closely. Dalton's voice rang out the clearest, frustrated, defensive, like a man caught off guard. Where's the call from? Dalton snapped. Washington? At this hour? Are you sure? The other voice was younger, belonging to the duty officer, junior in rank but noticeably less timid than before. He tried to keep his tone level. They said it's from the legal office, asking to confirm the status of a detainee. There's a lawyer, requesting immediate information. Malik slowly closed his eyes. Not from exhaustion, but understanding. What he had been waiting for was now in motion. Not fast, but deliberate. In the hallway, Dalton's voice dropped, no longer distinct, but the strain in every word was still obvious. He wasn't used to being cornered. Wasn't used to having his actions questioned. And definitely not used to being summoned by someone above him. A few minutes later, the cell door creaked open again. Dalton entered. He no longer strode with confidence. His steps were heavy, rushed, but unsure. The light from the hallway spilled over his face, revealing a flush of red and a sheen of sweat across his forehead. He stood there, just outside the bars. No arrogance now. He stared at Malik, as if trying to pierce through that calm exterior and find some kind of explanation. He mumbled, just loud enough for Malik to hear, "Who are you?" Malik slowly turned his head, locking eyes with him. No anger. No pride. Just a strange, unwavering calm. His voice was slow, clear, deliberate. "I haven't done anything. But a lot of people are very interested in what you've been doing." The words were soft, but the echo they left made Dalton step back half a pace. It was like the ground beneath him had shifted ever so slightly. Just enough to throw him off balance. Beads of sweat began to roll down his temples. At that moment, from the far end of the corridor, another man appeared. An officer of higher rank. His face stern, hair gray, uniform immaculate, the insignia on his collar gleaming under the light. He walked slowly, but with certainty. Without saying a word, he stopped in front of the holding cell and looked in. His eyes didn't scan or question. There was no surprise. Just a steady gaze, brief but deep, that carried a message both Malik and Dalton understood. In that moment, the wind had begun to change direction. He gave a slight nod, then turned away. No questions. No answers. That one look was enough to say it all. This would not be buried. Dalton watched as the officer's silhouette disappeared around the corner. He stayed silent. No more mockery. No more sharp glances. Just a heavy silence settling over him. He turned and walked out, each step slower than the last, like a man trying to steady himself after an invisible blow. The cell door closed behind him, this time with no loud slam. And Malik remained where he was. His back lightly against the wall, eyes forward. But now, there was something different in his gaze. It wasn't just patience anymore. It was expectation. Because he knew, the wheel had begun to turn. And this time, it wasn't stopping with him. The next morning, inside the Muskogee County Courthouse, time seemed to stand still. The sky outside was overcast, pale sunlight slipping through tall windows and casting a soft glow over the cold wooden benches of the courtroom. No one spoke loudly. Every footstep was careful. Scattered whispers quickly faded the moment the main courtroom door opened. Malik entered. No handcuffs. No signs of fatigue. He wore a deep navy suit, crisp white shirt, and neatly tied tie. His posture was upright, his gaze steady, every step grounded and composed. He didn't hold his head high, but his presence alone caused the room to fall silent for a beat. The most stunned person was Dalton. He sat to the right, hand resting on the desk, his face slowly hardening in disbelief. He couldn't take his eyes off Malik, as if he were looking at an entirely different man than the one he had called resistant the night before. It wasn't the suit. It was the energy. The way Malik walked in, like someone who had never been detained, never been demeaned. Before the judge could begin the session, a woman rose from the plaintiff's side. She had black hair, a small frame, and piercing eyes. She took one step forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, I would like to introduce my client, Dr. Malik Hayes, Senior Advisor to the United States Department of Defense." The courtroom reacted like it had been struck by lightning. Heads turned. A murmur rippled across the seats. A few camera shutters clicked. Dalton glanced at the lawyer, then back at Malik, his lips pressed tightly together. He didn't speak, but panic was beginning to show in his eyes. Malik's attorney continued, "My client was unlawfully detained, without justifiable cause. No evidence of wrongdoing, no warning, no explanation." She paused, then added, "We request the court to review footage from Officer Dalton's body camera during the incident." The judge nodded. An older man with silver hair and thin metal-framed glasses, he signaled for the clerk to begin. A screen flickered on before the court. Dalton swallowed hard. Sweat began to bead across his forehead. The video began to play. Every eye in the room was locked onto the screen. From the moment the patrol car's lights came on, to each of Dalton's commands, Malik's calm responses, the clink of the cuffs, and the officer's smug, domineering remarks, all of it unfolded in full view. No one spoke. No one interrupted. Malik didn't look at the footage. He didn't need to. He had lived every second of it. He kept his eyes forward, waiting for the truth to speak for itself. When the video ended, the courtroom was swallowed by silence. Not just shock, but a shared understanding. No one had to say it aloud. No further argument was needed. The truth was undeniable. And this time, the silence no longer belonged to Malik. After the video ended, the courtroom remained silent. No one dared speak. Even the judge fell quiet for a moment. He leaned back slightly, resting his hands on the wooden bench, eyes scanning the file before him as if weighing it, though the truth had already been laid bare in every frame on screen. A minute passed before he looked up, his voice low but firm, "This court finds Mr. Malik Hayes not guilty. The arrest was unlawful, improper in procedure, and shows signs of abuse of authority." His words weren't loud, but they struck with the force of finality. Those seated in the gallery turned to look at Malik, then shifted their gaze to Dalton. The judge continued, "The court also recommends an internal investigation into Officer Rick Dalton to examine the possibility of systemic misconduct." He didn't elaborate further, leaving the matter to the proper authorities, but everyone knew this was the beginning of the unraveling of a long-concealed pattern. Malik's attorney stepped forward. She no longer needed notes. Looking directly at the prosecution, her tone remained composed, "We have obtained data from the Internal Oversight Office. Over the past 5 years, Officer Dalton conducted a total of 412 traffic stops, over 70% of which targeted minorities, most of them black individuals." She paused for a beat, then added, "This disparity cannot be dismissed as coincidence." Dalton didn't respond. He sat frozen. His posture no longer upright. His hands no longer confidently resting on the table. His head bowed, lips tight, throat clenched. Each statement peeled back another layer of the image he had built. And now, there was nothing left to hide behind. A man in a black suit entered the courtroom. He approached Dalton's table and placed a thick envelope down. "From the mayor's office," he said quietly, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "A subpoena for a disciplinary hearing." It didn't stop there. A female representative from the police department stood up. Her voice was cold, concise, "Officer Rick Dalton, you are hereby suspended from duty effective immediately, pending investigation. No regret. No leniency. Just a statement of consequence." And that consequence was heavy enough to push a man off the path he once believed was untouchable. All eyes turned to Malik. But he didn't rise. He didn't smile. He simply looked at Dalton once, no hatred, no triumph. Just a warning. A silent reminder that wrongdoing, no matter how well hidden beneath a uniform, will eventually be dragged into the light. Dalton lowered his head. He said nothing. No objections. No resistance. He gathered the scattered papers on the table, stood up, and walked slowly toward the door. His silhouette faded into the hallway's light, each step weighed down by the shattered pieces of a reputation that had just crumbled on the courtroom floor. When the door closed behind him, The room remained still. But this time, the silence wasn't one of suspense. It was the echo of a power shift, of a man who once believed he was untouchable, brought to his knees by justice. On the top floor of the city government headquarters, a closed-door hearing was underway. The room wasn't large, but it was cold and solemn. On the table lay dozens of pages, case files, video transcripts, and excerpts of internal calls, meticulously arranged. No detail was overlooked. Dalton sat in the center, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes vacant. He was no longer the confident officer who had once entered the courtroom with authority. Across from him sat two representatives from Internal Affairs and an investigator from the City Integrity Commission. The questions came quickly. The voices weren't loud, but they were sharp, cutting through every excuse. The evidence was clear. His work history. The disproportionate number of stops. Internal audio recordings. Complaints from citizens. Dalton couldn't deny any of it. There was no room left to twist the truth. And for the first time in his career, he felt what it was like to be under a gaze that saw through everything. The police chief was present, gray-haired and tight-jawed. He didn't sugarcoat his words. "We will not cover for this. No one stands above protocol." The message was firm, no room for negotiation. Short, but heavy with the weight of a system being forced to wake up after too many years of silence. Dalton was stripped of his badge that very morning. He was placed on the federal investigation list for patterns of abuse of authority. And now, instead of enforcing the law, he would be the one subjected to it, scrutinized step by step. Meanwhile, across town, Malik sat in a small cafe. Morning light filtered through the frosted glass, casting a soft glow over the newspaper he held. On the front page, his name appeared in bold next to the headlines "Unlawful Arrest" and "A Pivotal Investigation." But Malik didn't smile. He just read quietly, eyes fixed on the lines, slowly stirring a cup of coffee that had gone cold. His phone vibrated. The number was unfamiliar, yet oddly recognizable. He answered. On the other end, a deep male voice introduced himself, from the Pentagon. They wanted him to speak, to share his experience, to discuss the system and what needed to change. Malik paused for a few seconds, then answered, "I don't like being a symbol. But silence is complicity. And I won't side with silence." The call ended. Malik placed the phone in his pocket, stood up, and left the cafe. On his way home, the sunlight grew stronger, casting warm patches over sidewalks still damp from the night's rain. He walked slowly, eyes fixed ahead. At the corner of a small park, he spotted a young black boy playing with a toy car. The child's laughter rang pure and clear through the peaceful morning. Nearby, the boy's mother watched lovingly, a soft smile on her lips. Malik paused. He didn't approach. Just observed. Then gave himself a quiet nod. He knew the road ahead was still long. But this morning, at least one thing had gone right. And he had done his part, not to become someone grand, but so that children like that boy could grow up in a fairer world. A world where people like Dalton would no longer think themselves untouchable. What happened to Malik is far from rare. Somewhere out there, people are still being pulled over simply because of the color of their skin. People are still being treated like criminals before they even say a word. But this time, something changed. The system could no longer look away. It was forced to take responsibility. Because when power is abused, silence is no longer an option. Silence means acceptance. It means allowing wrongs to go unchallenged. And Malik, even though he didn't raise his voice at first, chose not to bow to injustice. Every voice, no matter how small, can reach the heart of another. Every right action, even if taken alone, still has the power to shake a system once thought untouchable. And when enough people rise together, the world begins to shift. If this story made you pause and think, Share it. If something in it made you angry, leave a comment. And if you believe that justice is something worth protecting, subscribe to this channel and help spread what's right. Because change doesn't start with just one person. It starts with momentum. And only when we stand together can the system be truly forced to be fairer.